Hi, this is Ted. I'm talking to you today from high atop a mountain, somewhere in the United States. All right. I would like to talk today really about prophecy, the wells from which, the core beliefs from which prophets speak. First of all, I briefly want to talk to you today about Old Testament prophets. Then I'm going to get into the prophets of today, the so-called prophets. Old Testament prophets drank from a few wells. They had several core beliefs from which they prophesied. They talked to Israel about these things. So, and when God gave them revelation, when God spoke through them, these were the wells they drank from. Their core beliefs were reflected in what they said. Now, God gave the law to Moses. This is the first well from which they drank, their core beliefs. God gave the law to Moses. Not the rest of the Bible, because the New Testament didn't exist then. Neither the New Testament nor any of the other Old Testament except Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Leviticus. These were in existence at that time. There might have been one or two other books as well, but they focused always on the law. And the law stated you follow God only. The law also said you treat others well. Especially people who are in power and people who are wealthy should be treating powerless and the poor very well. These laws pretty much were focused on loving God and loving neighbor. And what the prophets saw was this was not being obeyed. And those laws warned if you didn't obey, problems could happen. This is the first well from which they drank, from which they supplied Israel teaching and prophecy. The second law from which they drank was that Israel was chosen by God. Israel did not choose God. God chose Israel. Abraham, the father of the nation, he did not choose God. God chose him. And that was critical and crucial to their teachings and to their prophecies. That God had chosen Israel and that God had given Israel laws. The third well from which they drank, the third core belief that influenced what they preached and what they taught, was the news of their day. The news of their day came from several sources. It came from messengers.
Come on, Concord! Message for you, sir. Concord.
Coming from other countries. It came from travelers. Coming from other countries. It also came from rumors. And they listened to the news of their day. And so when they prophesied to Israel, they said, listen, you have an Assyrian country up there, a country called Assyria, and it's on the rise. And they're vicious. They're vicious like no other country before has ever been. And if you don't start following the law of Moses like you should, you're going to be in trouble. You're going to be one of those cities, because they're taking one city after another. You're going to be next. And when Babylon rose, the prophets later on warned another part of Israel, the same thing could happen to you if you don't pay attention. So they had three different wells from which they drank, core beliefs that they passed on to the people that influenced their prophecies. And the first was God gave the law to Moses. Secondly, God chose Israel. And thirdly, the news of the day. Today's prophets, the wells from which they drink are, first of all, God is against the liberals. He is conservative. Therefore, in all likelihood in the United States, most Republicans are on God's side, most Democrats are not. The second well is the United States belongs to God the same way Israel belongs to God, or close to it. And because a few forefathers dedicated this country to God, this land belongs to God, no matter what. You'll see this and you will hear about this in their prophecies, that this land belongs to God. I do want to emphasize again, God chose Israel. A few of us dedicated this country to God. There's a little difference.
God has blessed, and He is blessing the United States of America.
Thirdly, the third well, and this is what they are leaning on now more than ever, a great revival is coming.
And I think when we're talking about the Great Awakening, that move of God, that all of us are convinced is coming our way.
Much more needs to be said about this revival, but I can tell you right now, the source of this revival really comes from the early 1950s, late 1940s, something called the Manifest Sons of God. Because in this revival, they believe that the power of God is going to be so strong in the followers of the apostles and prophets of today, the ones who call themselves apostles and prophets. The followers will be empowered with so much of God's power that every miracle that you see in the Bible, every one of them, will be commonplace among us.
What's going to happen spiritually? And let me say right off the front, all of us prophets are in agreement. We're on the edge of the greatest move of God that's ever taken place on planet Earth. The Great Awakening is going to awaken here throughout the earth. We're going to see miracles, signs, and wonders. And because of all that's going on in the natural, in the world, God always comes forth mightily in His power and glory. So I'm expecting the church to start demonstrating the power of God like never before. And we're going to be such great power that nations will have to acknowledge no God like Jesus Christ.
We've got a covering. If biological warfare were to come in contact with us, we'd be covered with something else that couldn't penetrate. What is it? The power of God, the deliverance of God, the Spirit of God.
This revival was expected in early 1950s. And the person who really reflects this best of all is George Warnock in his book, Feast of Tabernacles. And he believed that they were already starting this revival. But when things began to calm down, they always do, when things began to calm down and the excitement began to wane, he claimed that Christians had somehow quenched the Holy Spirit. So these three things you will see, and I want you to mark this, and when you listen to the prophets, listen for this. God is conservative. The United States belongs to God, and a fantastic, huge revival is coming. I'll talk more about that revival in days to come, and this is Ted. Have a good one.